After the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe, nothing dramatic happened all at once. There was no single morning when people woke up and declared that life had returned to normal. Instead, the change came quietly, slowly, almost unnoticed. Villages remained silent. Roads stayed empty. Fields waited patiently, untouched by hands that had once worked them every day. The plague did not end with celebration. It ended with absence. In many towns, the bells that once rang constantly for funerals now rang less often, not because people were joyful, but because there were simply fewer people left to bury. The air felt the same, yet somehow heavier, filled with memory rather than movement. Survivors moved carefully. They spoke softly. Many still believed the disease might return at any moment. They kept their distance, avoided unnecessary travel, and continued old habits of caution long after the danger had passed. In the countryside, farms sat idle. Wooden plows leaned against barns, untouched. Oxen wandered slowly, grazing where crops once grew in neat lines. The land itself seemed to rest, waiting for someone to notice it again. Those who survived the Black Death did not feel lucky. Survival felt ordinary, almost accidental. People focused on simple routines, waking up, eating bread, tending small tasks, then sleeping again. Markets reopened slowly. A single merchant might arrive in a town square with only a few goods. There was no crowd to meet him, no bargaining voices, just quiet exchanges of necessities. Churches remained open, though less crowded. Candles burned quietly in stone halls. Priests spoke of patience, humility, and endurance. Their sermons were calm and repetitive, offering comfort rather than explanation. At night, households settled early. There was little reason to stay awake. Oil was precious. Conversation was minimal. People listened to the wind outside, the creaking of old wood, and the distant sounds of animals. The Black Death had removed urgency from life. Everything moved slower now. Time itself seemed stretched. Days blended into one another without clear distinction. Work resumed not because of ambition, but because routine gave shape to empty hours. No one rushed to rebuild society. There was no grand plan. Recovery happened quietly, one small action at a time. A repaired fence, a replanted field, a single birth after years of loss. And so, after the Black Death ended, history did not rush forward. It rested. As the years passed, the quiet became familiar. People no longer spoke of before and after. Time softened those divisions. Days blended into one another, marked only by sunrise, work, and rest. In the countryside, hedges grew wild along unused paths. Birds nested where travelers once walked. Nature filled spaces without asking permission. Farmers adjusted their routines. With fewer mouths to feed, harvests felt sufficient without effort. Grain stores remained half full. There was no rush to expand fields or push boundaries. In towns, councils met less frequently. When they did gather, meetings were short. Decisions were simple. There was little conflict when there were fewer people to disagree. Markets reopened slowly. A handful of stalls appeared once or twice a week. Goods changed hands quietly. Bargaining was rare. Prices stayed steady, almost dull. Craftspeople worked alone more often. Apprentices were scarce. Skills passed slowly, patiently, from one generation to the next. Churches remained open, but services were calm and sparsely attended. Hymns echoed softly in large stone halls, lingering longer than the voices that created them. Monasteries became places of stillness once more. Monks rose before dawn, followed their routines, and returned to rest without distraction. Candles burned steadily. Shadows moved slowly along the walls. Written records from this period became thin. There was little to record. No wars, no great construction, no dramatic events demanding attention. Instead, life became a sequence of repeated actions: wake, work, eat, rest. Clothing was worn longer. Repairs replaced replacement. Shoes were patched. Cloaks were mended again and again. Nothing was wasted. At night, lamps glowed behind a few windows. Most streets remained dark. Silence settled easily, broken only by distant animals or wind moving through empty lanes. People slept deeply. Dreams were simple, often forgotten by morning. Children learned their letters slowly. Lessons were unhurried. There was time to repeat mistakes without consequence. Old buildings were repurposed quietly. A former merchant's hall became storage. A noble's house became a shared dwelling. No ceremonies marked these changes. The world did not feel smaller, only slower. Memory adjusted to this pace. Stories lost their sharp edges. Even fear softened with repetition and time. History moved forward without drama. And in this stillness, people continued living, quietly, steadily, without needing to hurry anywhere at all. As the years passed, the quiet became familiar. People no longer spoke of before and after. Time softened those divisions. Days blended into one another, marked only by sunrise, work, and rest. In the countryside, hedges grew wild along unused paths. Birds nested where travelers once walked. Nature filled spaces without asking permission. Farmers adjusted their routines. With fewer mouths to feed, harvests felt sufficient without effort. Grain stores remained half full. There was no rush to expand fields or push boundaries. In towns, councils met less frequently. When they did gather, meetings were short. Decisions were simple. There was little conflict when there were fewer people to disagree. Markets reopened slowly. A handful of stalls appeared once or twice a week. Goods changed hands quietly. Bargaining was rare. Prices stayed steady, almost dull. Craftspeople worked alone more often. Apprentices were scarce. Skills passed slowly, patiently, from one generation to the next. Churches remained open, but services were calm and sparsely attended. Hymns echoed softly in large stone halls, lingering longer than the voices that created them. Monasteries became places of stillness once more. Monks rose before dawn, followed their routines, and returned to rest without distraction. Candles burned steadily. Shadows moved slowly along the walls. Written records from this period became thin. There was little to record. No wars, no great construction, no dramatic events demanding attention. Instead, life became a sequence of repeated actions: wake, work, eat, rest. Clothing was worn longer. Repairs replaced replacement. Shoes were patched. Cloaks were mended again and again. Nothing was wasted. At night, lamps glowed behind a few windows. Most streets remained dark. Silence settled easily, broken only by distant animals or wind moving through empty lanes. People slept deeply. Dreams were simple, often forgotten by morning. Children learned their letters slowly. Lessons were unhurried. There was time to repeat mistakes without consequence. Old buildings were repurposed quietly. A former merchant's hall became storage. A noble's house became a shared dwelling. No ceremonies marked these changes. The world did not feel smaller, only slower. Memory adjusted to this pace. Stories lost their sharp edges. Even fear softened with repetition and time. History moved forward without drama. And in this stillness, people continued living, quietly, steadily, without needing to hurry anywhere at all. As time continued its slow movement forward, routines became more settled. People began to trust the quiet. The fear that once lingered in every sound gradually faded into habit. Doors were left open during the day. Windows stayed unshuttered longer into the evening. In villages, neighbors recognized one another again, not with excitement, but with familiarity. A nod, a brief greeting, nothing more was needed. Work resumed in its simplest form, a few hours in the fields, a few repairs around the home, then rest. There was no pressure to fill the day. Tools were shared more often. With fewer people, cooperation became easier. A plow passed from hand to hand, a ladder leaned against several houses in the same week. Animals returned to predictable patterns. Chickens wandered freely, sheep grazed calmly, dogs slept near doorways, uninterested in guarding against anything. In towns, streets were swept occasionally, not thoroughly, just enough. Dust settled again soon after, undisturbed. Shops opened irregularly. A baker might sell bread every other day. Customers arrived slowly, sometimes only one or two at a time. Conversations were brief and quiet. Money changed hands less frequently. Barter returned in small ways. A loaf of bread for a repaired shoe, a basket of vegetables for a few hours of help. Records from this time mentioned little beyond weather and harvests. Rain fell, crops grew modestly, winters passed without remark. Schools were informal. Children learned by listening, watching, repeating. There were no strict schedules. Lessons ended when attention drifted. Church bells rang at familiar hours. Their sound carried across empty spaces, softer than before. People listened, then continued whatever they were doing. Monks kept their hours faithfully. Prayer followed prayer. Silence followed silence. Each day resembled the one before it. Buildings aged quietly. Roofs sagged. Walls cracked slightly. Repairs were slow and minimal. Nothing collapsed suddenly. Everything endured. At night, families gathered near small fires. They spoke little, sometimes not at all. The warmth was enough. Sleep came early. Darkness filled rooms gently. Dreams were shallow, often blank. The world no longer expected urgency. There was time for everything, and nothing demanded to be done immediately. History, during these years, did not announce itself. It simply continued. Days passed with little to distinguish one from the next. The air remained still, carrying only faint sounds of wind through empty streets and rustling leaves in the distant forests. The sun rose and set with its usual precision, unnoticed beyond the patterns of light it left on walls and floors. In small villages, the number of households had decreased. Families that remained were fewer, yet they persisted in small routines. Water was drawn slowly from wells. Loaves of bread were baked one at a time. Meals were simple and predictable, eaten quietly at tables of plain wood. Farms showed signs of gradual recovery. Seeds were planted, but not in haste. Each furrow turned deliberately. Each sprout tended carefully. Patches of land once abandoned now held small crops, enough for subsistence. There was no rush to expand beyond what was manageable. Trades resumed in understated ways. Blacksmiths hammered slowly, forging nails or repairing tools. Potters shaped clay on wheels turned with gentle hands. Tailors mended garments until they were just as worn as before, then mended them again. Repetition became the rhythm of daily life. In town squares, markets opened sporadically. A merchant displayed a few goods on a simple wooden table. Passers-by approached slowly, sometimes not at all. Conversations were quiet, practical, and brief. Negotiation existed only as a gentle exchange of numbers or goods. Education took on a patient pace. Children learned letters and numbers not for immediate use, but because repetition over time instilled familiarity. Lessons were short, often paused for extended periods of quiet observation. The world itself became a tutor of slow, deliberate attention. Churches stood empty longer than before. Candles flickered along walls, illuminating stone floors polished over decades. Monks followed unchanging schedules, reading, copying texts, or tending gardens. Prayer was calm, measured, and repetitive, offering a soft rhythm to the otherwise silent days. Evenings were unhurried. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Animals returned to shelter, wandering slowly to feed or rest. Families, when present, gathered near small fires, speaking little, listening to the soft crackle of flames. Sleep arrived naturally, often before the night fully deepened. Rooms were cool, quiet, and dark. The absence of noise was itself soothing. Dreams were shallow, sometimes indistinct. Waking brought no sudden start, only the gentle resumption of routine. Over time, the quiet became ordinary. Life carried on not with energy or urgency, but through consistent, gentle action. Each day resembled the one before it. Each week passed with the same predictable rhythm. The Black Death, though departed, left a lingering habit, a world moving slower, observing more, and expecting less. History in these moments was a soft, ongoing hum rather than a sudden note. And so, after the Black Death ended, people continued, quietly, in the slow and deliberate passage of ordinary days. The countryside rested in long stretches of stillness. Fields lay open beneath the night sky, their outlines softened by darkness and light mist. Paths, once worn by many feet, now held only faint impressions, slowly fading with each passing season. Grass moved gently as a light breeze passed through, bending and rising again without urgency. Somewhere in the distance, a tree creaked softly, adjusting to its own weight. No one noticed. There was no reason to. Cottages stood far apart, separated by open land. A single candle glowed behind a small window, steady and unhurried. Inside, someone sat quietly, perhaps mending cloth or simply watching the flame sway. There was no need to finish quickly. Rain began to fall again, thin and even. Each drop landed without force, darkening soil and stone. The sound was soft and repetitive, blending into the night until it became part of the silence rather than a break from it. Animals rested where they pleased. Sheep lay close together in shallow shelter. Horses stood still, heads lowered, breathing slow and deep. Even the birds remained quiet, tucked away and unmoving. Travel had become rare. Roads stretched outward, empty and patient. No carts passed, no voices echoed. The land itself seemed content to remain undisturbed. In earlier years, this stillness might have felt unsettling. Now it felt normal. The world had learned to exist without constant motion. Farms were smaller than before, but steadier. Each field was worked only as much as needed. Nothing was wasted, nothing was rushed. The rhythm of planting and harvesting had returned in a quieter form. Time itself felt broader. Days were no longer divided sharply by tasks. Morning blended into afternoon, evening drifted naturally into night. People followed light rather than clocks. When sleep came, it did so gently. There were no lingering worries that demanded attention. Thoughts slowed on their own, like footsteps fading along a path. Dreams were simple. Sometimes they were nothing more than darkness and warmth. Sometimes they carried fragments of ordinary life, fields, rain, candlelight, arranged without meaning. The land held memory quietly. It remembered the absence, the loss, without speaking of it. New growth covered old ground slowly, layer by layer. Stars moved overhead, steady and indifferent. They had watched everything before, and they continued to watch now, unchanged. and beneath them, the countryside remained calm. It breathed in the cool night air and released it again, without effort. After the Black Death ended, life did not return all at once. It returned slowly, quietly, and it stayed that way. Morning arrived without ceremony. Light crept slowly across the land, pale and cool, touching fields and rooftops in no particular order. Shadows shifted gently, then settled again. Villages stirred only slightly. A door opened. A bucket was lifted. Footsteps moved across packed earth, unhurried and familiar. No one felt late. There was no schedule to keep. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin lines, barely visible against the sky. Fires were lit not for urgency, but for warmth and habit. The scent of damp wood drifted briefly, then faded. People worked in short stretches. A fence was adjusted. A roof tile was placed back into position. Each task ended when it felt complete, not when a list was finished. Children played quietly near doorways. Their games were simple and slow. Stones were stacked, then knocked down, then stacked again. Laughter was rare, but contentment was common. Animals followed the same paths each day. Cows moved toward pasture. Chickens wandered, pecking without direction. Dogs slept wherever the sun happened to reach. In towns, bells marked the hours, but few listened closely. The sound was familiar enough to blend into the background. Life continued regardless of the time it announced. Records from these years remained sparse. There were few events worth recording. Harvests were modest, winters were cold but survivable, summers passed without incident. Shops opened when their owners felt ready. Goods were simple: cloth, tools, grain. Nothing new appeared suddenly. Everything arrived gradually. Even disputes were rare. With fewer people and simpler needs, there was little to argue about. Problems were solved slowly, often without words. By afternoon, activity faded again. The land grew quiet as shadows lengthened. Work paused naturally, as if the day itself suggested rest. Evening meals were small and familiar: bread, broth, vegetables. Meals were eaten without hurry, sometimes in silence. As darkness returned, candles were lit. Their light softened the edges of rooms, leaving corners untouched. The world became smaller and easier to hold in thought. Sleep followed soon after. Bodies rested without resistance. Minds drifted without effort. Outside, the village returned to stillness. Paths waited, fields rested. The night settled in, patient and unchanging. After the Black Death ended, life continued not with celebration, but with routine. And routine, over time, became peace. Night settled once more over the land, familiar and predictable. The sky darkened evenly, without drama, as the last traces of daylight softened and disappeared. Stars appeared slowly, one by one, faint and distant. Houses closed themselves for the night. Shutters rested against windows. Doors were secured with simple wooden bars, not from fear, but from habit. Inside, rooms grew quiet. Candles burned steadily. Their flames did not flicker much, protected from drafts. Shadows rested along stone walls, unmoving and calm. People prepared for sleep without conversation. Cloaks were folded, shoes were set aside, bedding was adjusted just enough to be comfortable. Nothing needed perfection. In monasteries, monks followed the same order they had followed for years. Evening prayers were spoken softly, their words familiar enough to require no thought. Silence followed, deep and complete. Outside, rain returned lightly, touching rooftops and paths with soft persistence. Water gathered slowly in shallow places, reflecting small points of candlelight before darkening again. The sound of rain spread evenly across the land, creating a steady background that masked all else. It was neither loud nor quiet. It simply existed. Animals settled deeper into rest.
Horses shifted their weight once, then became still. Birds remained hidden. Even insects seemed subdued. Roads remained empty. No travelers arrived late. No carts moved through the night. The land accepted the pause without resistance. Sleep arrived gradually. Thoughts slowed, then faded. There was no need to remember the day in detail. It had been like many others. Dreams drifted lightly. Some carried images of fields, candle flames, stone walls. Others carried nothing at all. The world rested as a whole. Villages, towns, and countryside shared the same stillness, uninterrupted and complete. Time passed without being noticed. When morning eventually returned, it would do so quietly, as always. There would be no announcement, no change in rhythm. After the Black Death ended, the nights became ordinary again. And in that ordinariness, the world found rest.
The days that followed did not differ much from those that came before. The land seemed content with repetition. Each morning carried the same pale light, each evening the same gradual dimming. People noticed the seasons more than the years. Leaves changed color. Cold air arrived gently. Warmth returned in time. Nothing arrived early. Nothing overstayed. Villages aged quietly. Wood darkened with weather. Stone grew smoother from wind and rain. Buildings remained standing, unchanged, patient. Farms adjusted to the new pace of life. With fewer hands, fields were smaller, yet they were tended carefully. Each row was planted with intention. Each harvest was modest but sufficient. Neighbors helped one another without discussion. A fence repaired here, a roof adjusted there. These acts were ordinary, expected, and unremarkable. Markets continued but without energy. Goods were laid out neatly. Buyers came and went slowly. Transactions were brief and calm. Travelers, when they appeared, were welcomed without curiosity. News traveled slowly, often already outdated by the time it arrived. Few listened closely. In records kept by monasteries, the entries remained brief. Weather noted, births recorded, deaths acknowledged. Life continued without commentary. Church bells rang on schedule. Their sound marked time gently, without urgency. People listened, then returned to their tasks. Children grew taller, elders moved more slowly. The balance remained stable. Evenings followed predictable patterns. Fires were lit, meals were shared. Silence filled the spaces between words. Rain came and went. Wind passed through fields. Snow fell when it was time. Sleep remained easy. Bodies rested without effort. Dreams required little attention. The memory of the plague softened further, becoming a distant shape rather than a sharp edge. It remained part of the past, no longer part of the present. Life, after the Black Death ended, did not accelerate. It settled, and in settling, it endured. Years passed without clear markers. People remembered time not by dates, but by small changes. A tree grew taller. A wall leaned a little more. A path became smoother from repeated steps. The land remained steady. Fields produced enough. Rain arrived when expected. Frost covered the ground in winter, then melted away in spring. Villages maintained their size. Few new buildings appeared. Old ones remained useful. Repairs were made only when necessary. Trades continued quietly. Smiths worked slowly. Weavers produced cloth at an even pace. Each craft followed routines refined by repetition. Tools aged gracefully. Handles smoothed by hands. Metal dulled, then sharpened again. Nothing was discarded quickly. Meals remained simple. Bread, vegetables, occasional meat. There was little variety, but plenty of familiarity. Even celebrations were subdued. Holidays passed with modest gatherings, a shared meal, a short prayer, then life returned to routine. The world did not seek excitement, it valued stability. Children learned from watching, adults taught without instruction, knowledge passed gently from one generation to the next. The past remained present only in memory. Stories were told rarely and without detail. The plague became a reference point, not a subject. Sleep remained deep and untroubled. Nights were long, days were manageable. Stars continued their paths, seasons turned without pause. After the Black Death ended, life did not seek to replace what was lost. It adapted, quietly.
Morning returned again, gentle and predictable. Light spread across stone and soil without urgency, warming surfaces slowly. Shadows shortened, then rested where they fell. People rose when they felt ready, some earlier, some later. There was no correct time. The day waited patiently for everyone. Water was carried from wells in steady steps. The bucket moved up and down, rope sliding softly against stone. The sound repeated until it faded into the background. Work began in small portions. A garden was weeded for a short while. Grain was sorted carefully, one handful at a time. Hands moved with familiarity, guided more by memory than thought. Animals followed their routines. Cows stepped into open fields. Chickens gathered near feed. Cats stretched lazily, then found warm places to rest again. In towns, streets remained calm. Footsteps echoed briefly, then disappeared. Doors opened and closed without announcement. Shops displayed the same items as before. Cloth folded neatly, tools arranged carefully. Customers paused, considered, and chose slowly. Monasteries continued unchanged. Bells rang at fixed hours. Prayers were spoken softly. Silence filled the spaces in between. Education continued quietly. Children practiced letters on worn tablets. Mistakes were corrected gently. Progress came slowly, without pressure. Afternoons passed almost unnoticed. Light shifted. Air cooled slightly. Activity decreased naturally. Evenings returned with familiarity. Fires were lit. Meals prepared. The day concluded without review. Sleep followed as it always did. Bodies rested easily. Minds drifted. The world remained steady. After the Black Death ended, life moved forward without haste. And that was enough.
The land continued its slow rhythm, unchanged by expectation. Fields rested when they needed to. Work resumed only when the day allowed it. Nothing demanded attention all at once. Villages maintained their quiet balance. Homes stood where they always had, neither expanding nor shrinking. Paths connected the same places, worn smooth by years of use. People moved with economy. Each step served a purpose, but no more than necessary. Energy was preserved, not spent. Rain arrived softly, then passed. Puddles reflected the sky briefly before fading. The earth absorbed what it needed. Trees grew without notice. Rings formed quietly beneath bark. Leaves fell in time, then returned. Markets continued with minimal change. Goods were familiar, prices remained stable. Trade occurred without urgency. In monasteries, books were copied patiently. Letters formed slowly. Mistakes were corrected calmly. Pages filled over long stretches of time. Stories were shared occasionally, not to entertain, but to remember. Words were few, details were simple. The plague remained a distant memory. It shaped habits, not thoughts. Cleanliness improved, space was valued. Sleep remained deep. Nights passed smoothly. The world endured. Time moved forward without drawing attention to itself. Weeks passed, then months.
blending together so smoothly that few could say where one ended and another began. Life no longer needed clear divisions. The countryside remained patient. Fields rested between seasons, covered in frost or softened by rain. When planting time came, it arrived naturally, without announcement. Villages continued their quiet existence. Smoke rose gently from chimneys in thin lines that dissolved into the sky. Doors opened and closed. Steps crossed the same ground again and again. People aged slowly. Faces gained lines. Hair changed color. These changes were noticed only in passing, never discussed at length. Children grew into the rhythms around them. They learned not by instruction, but by repetition, watching, doing, resting. Work remained steady and unremarkable. Tasks were completed when they needed to be, then set aside. There was no reward for speed. In towns, walls stood firm. Streets stayed narrow. Nothing expanded beyond necessity. Faith remained quiet. Prayer was spoken softly. Reflection happened without urgency. Records continued to be kept, though they said little. Weather, harvest, simple facts. Nights returned faithfully. Darkness settled. Candles burned low. Sleep followed without effort. Dreams remained shallow and calm. The world felt complete in its simplicity. After the Black Death ended, history did not rush forward. It walked, slowly, and it kept walking.
Nothing new interrupted the pattern of days. The world seemed comfortable repeating itself. Morning followed night, and night followed morning, without variation. Light moved slowly across walls and fields. It lingered briefly on stone, then drifted onward. No one marked the moment. There was no need. Villagers continued their routines with quiet confidence. Water was drawn, bread was baked, cloth was folded. Each action followed another, not because it was planned, but because it had always been done that way. Tools rested where they were last placed. When they were needed again, hands found them easily. Familiarity guided every movement. Paths between homes remained clear. Grass stayed pressed low from years of walking. Each step followed an earlier one, fitting neatly into the land. The countryside breathed evenly. Wind passed through trees without sound. Clouds moved slowly, changing shape without purpose. Animals followed the same patterns each day. They ate. They rested. They moved only when necessary. In towns, nothing demanded attention. Shops opened and closed quietly. Goods remained the same. Faces were familiar. Monks continued their work. Pages filled slowly with careful writing. Ink dried patiently. Books grew heavier over time. Knowledge moved at the same pace. Nothing was rushed, nothing was forgotten quickly. Even illness passed quietly now. Care was gentle. Recovery was slow. Life continued around it without pause. Evenings settled gently. Fires warmed small spaces. Silence filled large ones. Sleep arrived naturally. There was no resistance, no restless thought. The world rested. After the Black Death ended, life did not search for meaning. It lived. The passage of time became something people felt rather than measured. There were no urgent reasons to count days closely. Seasons arrived when they were ready and departed just as calmly. Morning sounds remained minimal. A bird shifted on a branch. A door creaked slightly as it opened. Footsteps crossed packed earth, then faded. Fields waited patiently between uses. Soil rested beneath thin layers of leaves or frost. When worked, it yielded slowly and steadily, without resistance. Villagers spoke less as years passed. Words were saved for necessity. Silence grew comfortable, even welcome. Homes changed very little. Furniture stayed in the same places. Walls gathered the marks of time quietly. Repairs were made only when needed. In towns, the same routes were followed daily. People walked them without thought, guided by habit alone. Markets continued, sparse and calm. Goods changed hands quietly. No one hurried. Monasteries remained steady centers of routine. Bells rang, prayers were spoken, work continued without interruption. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Pages filled, shelves grew heavier. Nothing was rushed to completion. The memory of the plague remained distant. It shaped customs, not conversation. Life adapted around it, without dwelling on it. Evenings returned with the same gentle cues. Light faded, fires were lit. The day concluded naturally. Sleep remained deep and easy. Dreams asked for nothing. The world continued. The land seemed to settle further into itself as years passed. Nothing pressed forward, nothing fell behind. Everything existed in balance. Villages remained modest in size. Houses stayed where they had always been. New construction was rare and slow, completed only when absolutely necessary. People moved through their days with minimal effort. Tasks were performed gently. Energy was conserved. Paths through fields and forests were well known. Feet followed them without thought. Grass bent, then rose again. Trees grew steadily. Their branches widened. Their roots pressed deeper into the soil. Growth happened quietly. In towns, the rhythm remained unchanged. Shops opened, shops closed. Goods remained familiar. Monks continued copying texts. Each letter was formed carefully. Pages filled slowly. Time passed unnoticed. Records were kept without commentary. Weather noted. Harvests counted. Life continued. The world remained calm. The days blended together so completely that memory no longer separated them. One morning felt much like another. Light arrived, lingered, and faded without leaving a strong impression behind. Villagers rose slowly. Some stayed seated longer than others, listening to the quiet before beginning. The day did not demand immediate movement. Water was fetched in measured steps, buckets filled and empty. The sound repeated gently, then stopped. Work appeared in small pieces. A patch of earth was turned. A basket was mended. Each task ended when the hands grew tired, not when the task was finished. Animals moved calmly through familiar spaces. Hooves pressed into soil that remembered them well. Feathers rustled softly, then settled again. The air remained steady. Wind passed through fields without urgency. Clouds drifted slowly, reshaping themselves without purpose. In towns, walls held their places. Streets remained narrow and quiet. Doors opened and closed without remark. Markets were simple gatherings. A few goods laid out, a few exchanges made. No one lingered longer than necessary. Monasteries continued their pattern. Silence filled long hours. Pages turned slowly. Ink dried patiently. Knowledge accumulated without hurry. No one asked how long it would take. Evenings returned as expected. Light faded. Fires were lit. The day ended without reflection. Sleep followed easily. Thoughts loosened. Breathing slowed. The world rested. After the Black Death ended, life did not rebuild loudly. It settled into stillness and remained there. By now, the quiet had become permanent. No one expected anything else from the days.
Life existed without anticipation, and that absence felt comfortable. The land rested into its final rhythm. Fields no longer felt empty or full, they simply were. Grass grew, was cut, and grew again without comment. Villages felt complete in their stillness. Houses stood exactly where they belonged. Nothing leaned too far, nothing demanded repair. People moved gently through familiar spaces. Every motion felt practiced, requiring little attention. Hands worked while minds rested. Paths were smooth from years of walking. Each footprint fit easily into the next, as if the land remembered where feet belonged. Animals lived close to people without disturbance. They shared the same calm routines. Feeding, resting, moving. All happened without urgency. In towns, time left no visible mark. Streets stayed quiet. Shops carried the same goods. Faces remained familiar. Monasteries continued unchanged. Bells rang softly. Pages turned. Silence filled the spaces between sounds. Records ended abruptly in many places, not from loss, but from lack of anything new to record. Life continued without needing documentation. Even illness passed quietly now. Care was gentle. Recovery was slow. Nothing disrupted the calm. Evenings arrived with certainty. Candles burned low. Rooms dimmed gradually. Sleep followed without effort. Dreams thinned further, sometimes disappearing entirely. Rest became deeper than thought. The world felt complete in its simplicity. After the Black Death ended, history did not announce a new beginning. It faded into routine, and routine became rest.